Hi, welcome
Hello.
to the Jewish Book Village. We are here with Dr. Emmet Hirsch. Emmet, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Emmet Hirsch is an obstetrician gynecologist in the Chicago area. He is a published author of many different genres. You've written works related to your medical background and your medical career. You've also written a number of short stories and novels, including this fantastic thriller, which we are going to talk about today, The Wolf Shall Dwell with the Lamb. So I'm very happy that we are getting a chance to talk because I just finished reading your book and I found it to be fascinating. So I have a lot of questions for you. So Emmett, I want to start first of all with your name, okay? You had mentioned to me that it's pronounced in a specific way, and I wanted to know if you could tell us about your name and then maybe give us a little bit of your personal background.
Name is Emmet, in Hebrew, Aleph Mem Taf. It's been a big burden to me throughout my life because the word means truth, and I've felt an obligation to tell the truth always. My parents believed, and I also believe, that a person's name is a reflection of who they are and of also an influence on their life. So when we named our children, for example, we waited until they were born to choose their names. We didn't do that in advance. Try to figure out what their natures are and select the name. So that's what my name is, and I've felt an obligation to truth.
Beautiful. Can you tell us where did you grow up?
I was born in Chicago, Illinois. My father was a rabbi, a Reform rabbi. At the time, he was the director of the Reform Movement's Midwest Regional Center, Midwest region for the Reform Movement. Later on, when I was two, we moved to Washington, D.C., where he took on the role of the executive director of what's called the Religious Action Center,
Mhm.
which was the Reform Movement's social justice arm. He was very involved in the American Civil Rights Movement with Martin Luther King, and the legislation, civil rights legislation took place. It was drafted in his offices in Washington. He participated in the March on Selma, a very famous event in civil rights. After that job, he took the role of the executive director of the World Reform. The national organizations are organized into a world movement, and he was the executive director there. And he moved the office from New York to Jerusalem. So we moved when I was 13 years old to Israel, and I grew up in this very formative period of my life, from 13 to 22 in Israel, served in the army, and then came back to the United States for my medical education at the age of 22, combined undergraduate and medical education, and I've been here ever since. And I'll mention my mother too, just to make sure I include her in this story. She was a she grew up in the Ural Mountains in Russia during World War II. Extreme poverty, a remarkable life story, which we can talk about later if there's time. And then after the war, she migrated with all the other hundreds of thousands of Jews, found her way to Bergen-Belsen, which at the time was a DP camp, and then arrived in Israel on the first boat that landed after the establishment of the State of Israel on May 15th, 1948. And then she found her way to the United States, met my father, had a very romantic love story, which we probably won't have time to tell, and then raised a family. And eventually, everybody went back to Israel, where his family had already resided.
Wow. Fascinating. Fascinating. So there are many different pieces of this that I feel like probably influenced your writing and influenced the novel. But before we connect those pieces, can you give us a brief summary of what your book is about?
The book is about a boy and a man because it covers his entire life, who was born in Lebanon to a Jewish girl, married at the age of 14 or 15 to a much older Jewish European man. So she was from a Sephardic family, a Syrian Jewish family, married off in great haste to this older man with whom she had an non-loving relationship. His child was born. And when they divorced and she was remarried he was sent to be raised in a Catholic convent. This stream of Catholicism in Lebanon is called Maronite, and there he was raised with a life that was certainly tolerable and even good, given his circumstances of having been abandoned by his parents, raised as an orphan, even though both his parents were still alive. And he developed into this very remarkable person. He educated himself. He spoke 5 languages. He was, bold, and he was innovative and all these things. But for reasons that are, explained in the book, life becomes intolerable for him. So he migrates on foot to Palestine, which is Israel before the establishment of the state, and he participates in Israel's War of Independence as a soldier, and then later on returns to Lebanon as a spy. And the rest of the book is about his adventures.
So, can you tell us a bit about what the background is to this story? What inspired you to write this narrative?
The genesis of the story was my reflection of my mother-in-law's life. My mother-in-law, Eliza Feldman, who was also a remarkable woman, just amazing. She was the kind of woman where you met her and immediately fell in love with her, which is what happened to me. I was already in love with her daughter, but falling in love with the mother, with her mother, was kind of it wasn't obviously going to happen, but it did. So her life story, or I should say, Joseph, the protagonist of this novel, life story is based on her life story. She was born to a teenage mother, Jewish Syrian girl, married at the age of 14 to a European businessman. That girl had 2 children, Eliza's older sister, Chava, at the age of 15, and then Eliza at the age of 17. A few years later, she divorced, remarried a Christian. The girls were sent to a Catholic convent to be raised. Life became terrible for them there. And then one day, an Uncle Abud was his name. Abud, such an Arabic name. But these Jewish families from Syria, they were Arab Jews, essentially, that's what they even call themselves. Came one day, Uncle Abud came, told the nuns he was taking the girls out for a drive, and he took them and drove them right across the border to Palestine, where they were raised in a kibbutz with all the other orphans. It was the perfect place and time to be an orphan because of all the Jewish refugees. And there despite this terrible beginning to her life, she became this remarkable woman. She had all sorts of incredible traits and skills, and she raised 4 wonderful children in Evanston, Illinois. How she wound up in Evanston, Illinois is a different story.
Yeah.
But the genesis of the tale came from reflection about her life.
She must be extraordinary because there are very few people who would speak so highly of their mother-in-law.
Well, I mean, I've said my whole life the most difficult of all relationships is mother-in-law, daughter-in-law. That, I think, nothing is more difficult than that. Mother-in-law, son-in-law, usually I think I've observed that works out.
Okay, got it.
If there's time, I can tell you an amazing story about her
Okay.
if you're interested. She was so beautiful. She was breathtakingly beautiful. And there was a poet called Chaim Hefer, an Israeli poet. He was kind of like the poet laureate of the Palmach, which was Israel's special elite fighting units before establishment of the state. So the army, the underground army, was called the Haganah. The Haganah had a special section called the Palmach. And Chaim Hefer was a Palmachnik and also a poet, and he wrote many of the famous poems and songs that everybody knows because it's part of this lore of the establishment of the state. So there's a very famous song called He Never Knew Her Name that I knew as a young person. It's extremely romantic. I fell in love with the song, and it's just wonderful. It's about a soldier and a nurse, and they develop this relationship in a moment of crisis, and he dies. And he never asked her name. He never knew her name. And he reflects on how he never knew her name. She reflects on he never knew her name. And that's the title of the song. So what they said about my beautiful mother-in-law, Eliza, is that Chaim Hefer was in the kibbutz dining room one day and caught a glimpse of Eliza, and he never knew her name. And he was so inspired by her beauty that he wrote that poem, which
Wow.
was later turned into a song.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's so beautiful. Now, I haven't listened to the song, but I am going to look it up and listen to it.
I mean, when I was growing up, everybody knew the song. And you may recognize it when you listen to it. It's
It could
available,
be.
various versions. It's one of those old songs performed by the military troops, the
Hmm.
song groups.
Okay. So you're saying that the novel and the character of Joseph was largely based on Eliza. And yet the direction that you take Joseph's life is so extraordinary that he goes into the Haganah. which was the precursor to the IDF, and then he becomes a spy. The details that you write in the book are so vivid. And so I'm curious if you can kind of take us into the story. How did you think of such a plot that was so intricate?
I mean, his origin is Eliza's origin, but the rest of it is completely different. And I had a notion of where I was going and where I would wind up. To be honest, I don't recall how I got there. And in some ways, the story wrote itself. I found ways for Joseph to participate in certain historical events. There are several events that he is a player in, whether through accident or via his role as a spy. But I wanted to tell a human story, and what this tale is really about is it's about childhood trauma and a lifelong search to recover from trauma and redeeming oneself. He had to redeem himself. No one was going to do it for him. And it happens to be a story about a spy, but it's not a, I don't think, a typical spy story. Although there are elements of adventure and thrill and danger, and he has to be very inventive, bold. So, but all these the more important part, I think, are, the messages have to do with the human relationships. And as I say, in some ways, I think the story wrote itself. I found myself having completed one scene, I sort of naturally was led to the next scene without necessarily plotting in advance how I was going to.
And even so, I mean, I feel like you're being very modest and kind to yourself that you're saying that the story wrote itself, because from what I picked up very quickly after reading just a few chapters of the book is the extent of knowledge that this requires. I mean, you put in a lot of detail about history, military, geography, religion, language. There's a lot of different layers here. And so I'm curious if you could tell us what your research process involved.
I grew up with this history as a student, a high school student in Israel. We learned a lot of this. I grew up in the culture. I was in the youth in Israel participate in this kind of pre-military training called Gadna. I was in the Gadna with everybody. I was really caught up in this Zionist, socialist kind of ethos in Israel. So I already knew a fair amount of this history. And then I read some books by Jewish and non-Jewish authors to enhance my knowledge. In particular, the details of how to be an Israeli spy come from two references. One is Mati Friedman's Spies of No Country, which is about the early days of the Mistarabin, those who pose as Arabs. An example of that kind of unit is in the show Fauda that's become popular in recent years. So Mati Friedman talks about the early days of that, which Joseph was one of those agents. And then Ronen Bergman's book, Rise and Kill First, which is about the Mossad. So much information in there about how the Mossad operates. The book focuses on their assassination programs, but there's lots of information in there. And then the Palmach site, I read a book called The 100 Years War on Palestine, which is written from the perspective it's by an author called Rashid Khalidi, and it takes the point of view of, the Nakba and how from the beginning, he characterizes Zionism as a colonialist movement and how they were in cahoots with the world powers. So all of this information I gathered and tried to incorporate it into a vision of the history. And then for me, it was important to add details. I mean, small details. I wanted to make everything believable, and I needed to explain, I think, to readers. Like, for example, he goes on foot from, of this town called Hamdoun in Lebanon to Palestine's 90-kilometer back roads trek. How did he do it? So I talk a little bit about orienteering there. How do you do that? How do you orient by the stars? How do you use a compass? How do you know how many meters you've passed? Things I learned in the army when I was a soldier, and various other details that I felt were important. And I'm glad to hear that they don't get in the way of the story. Seems like for you, at least, they enhance the experience.
Yes. Yeah. I think for somebody who has familiarity, even just a preliminary familiarity with with the Middle East, with, Middle Eastern history. It's not overwhelming at all. It certainly enhances it.
I've heard that from other people. I think people really like the level of detail that's in there.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So you are an extremely busy doctor. You're a very busy and active researcher. And I'm sure many other things that are happening in your life. You're still actively delivering babies. And so how do you manage to write a novel? When do you write? Where do you write?
I'll
Bring us.
add to the things you mentioned that I do. I'm also a husband and a father of four
Yeah,
children, extended family, which is important to me. Well, my father-in-law once said something that influenced me. He said, if you want something got done, give it to a busy person to do. So I like to be busy. I like to think of myself as someone who has skills in different domains, lots of different domains. So I'm not, I would say I'm not the best at anything, but I'm good at lots of things. I at least would like to be that way. I like to be very knowledgeable about things, so I'm constantly trying to learn whatever the domain is. And when the children were, this is my second novel. My first novel was about a resident in obstetrics and gynecology, so also a topic I know very, say, write what you know. So my two novels have been about things I know very well. And while the children were growing up, the writing was not something I did a lot of, although there were other forms of creativity I engaged in. And then as the children grew up and left the house, I found more time. I was able to publish my first novel. That I worked on for a couple of decades, nights and weekends and early mornings on vacations, and everyone was asleep. I'd be working on the novel. And then now even though I'm busy at work, I find time to write.
wonderful. That's wonderful. This is one of the questions that comes up a lot with many of the writers that I meet with, aspiring authors. I feel like there's always a curiosity about how creative writers actually produce their works. So it's very interesting to hear that background.
I don't have set times of day. I know that some people are very disciplined, and maybe I'm in the middle. I'm not extremely disciplined, but when I sit down to write, I'm able to focus. I have to be able to focus for like a couple hours.
Mhm.
Otherwise, it's not worth the effort.
Yeah, yeah, I get that. Get that. So you and I have spoken a lot about your intentional emphasis on the humanity and empathy in the narrative, in the characters that you depicted in the book, and you're addressing a very complex topic, the Arab-Israeli conflict. In this case, in the book, the narrative takes place in the 1930s and 40s, so it's right before the state of Israel was established. And so I would like to explore with you that emphasis on empathy. Do you feel that your own upbringing, the values that your parents gave to you, that you brought you up with, have influenced this desire to, for compassion and for understanding the different narratives that are involved in this conflict?
I think so. I grew up in, I would say, a liberal household. And my father's work for his mid-career was civil rights. So I grew up with this notion of trying to understand people from diverse backgrounds and also to work for social justice. And so it's clear that the forces of history that necessitated the establishment of the State of Israel did so in a time and place that created a tragedy for others. So, I certainly I'm not insensitive or dismissive of Palestinian aspirations and longing and displacement and sense of loss. So those things are something I feel. I'm not saying that there's easy solutions for, when the problem is that two people feel that they're entitled to the very same space, to occupy the same space, and they're unwilling to share it, how can they get along? It's a serious problem. I'm not saying I have solutions to that, but I feel uh, the pain and longing of everyone, and that is reflected, I think, in the characters. I think I hope what I aspired to do was to make it easy or, at least approachable for people to get a flavor of how there's more than two sides, I think, to this, but how the different sides view their worlds using the same set of facts. And the facts as you know, are under dispute also. But you know, the how they experience it and well, what they do with their lives being in this circumstance. So I think the humanity. I tried to make the humanity come out, and certainly there are villains in the story. There are villains, but there are plenty of good people struggling to make a life in this, you know, region of the world that is just constantly in turmoil.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, because I'm in the space of writers and authors and people who talk about books often, I see that there's ongoing discussion about, I guess, the validity of turning to fiction to understand a conflict and to understand a certain culture. Some people feel strongly that if you want to know the history and the culture of, a particular people or nation, you should go to, a history book or to a nonfiction work with referenced sources. And you have read a tremendous amount, and you've also lived here in Israel. And so I'm curious if you have a comment about that. What are your thoughts about using historical novels, fiction, to understand the history and culture of the Middle East?
First of all, I'm among those who think you should read works of nonfiction in order to understand complex situations. And as I said earlier, I want to know as much as I can about as much as I can. So yes, I think that that's my approach. That has been my approach. I'm a data-driven person. My whole professional life is all about data and about facts and evidence, and that's how I think. And that, by the way, is why I think it was important to me to put all these details in the book, because I couldn't imagine not having detailed explanations for everything that's going on. But I think there are insights that they're human insights, probably more easily available, approachable via fiction. And there are some people, I think, who don't read reference works of nonfiction and do get their information from other resources. Some of those are bad resources, Twitter and Instagram, or a kind of one-line or telegraphic sorts of sources of information. So for those people who access this kind of thing via fiction, I wanted to be there for them. And I wanted to do so responsibly, because I think there are some people who do it irresponsibly. And I tried to portray this very complex situation in a way that's complex and that people can begin to understand. And mostly, I don't mind telling you what I had in my mind. My hope is that people who have developed since October 7th, 2023, this negative reaction to Zionism, like almost a knee-jerk reaction to Zionism, and turned Zionism into a bad word, like it's an epithet,
Yeah.
Zionism. I wanted those people, including Jews, who have lost their commitment or their faith in Zionism, I was hoping to restore the Jews who have lost it, faith in Zionism, for those who have this knee-jerk reaction to what Zionism is and feel negative about it, to understand that the history and why, as I said earlier, the historical trend necessitated the establishment of the state of Israel, and remind people of that. And at the same time, validate the after effects of Zionism, and how that has resulted in terrible pain for so many Palestinians and Arabs in the Middle East.
Yeah, I think there seems to be so few books that try to show this balance. And it seems like we live in this world where there's this binary thinking of you're either this way or that way. You're either for or against. And there are so few sources out there that do what you're, describing, where you're really showing that that there are two sides and there is a conflict and there's a lot of emotions and sensitivities involved.
Yeah, I mean, yes, and I think the key to that for my book is trying to portray the humanity. And that without having that approach, I think it would have been difficult.
Yeah.
And it's not a political book. It's not a work of history. It's a book that takes place in a certain time and place. And well, I think it was just natural to try to portray the human beings involved in those events.
Yeah. So I What was going through my mind when I was reading this is I felt like Joseph, throughout his whole life, he had different role models who gave him a glimpse of that humanity and that sensitivity. The doctor, I don't want to give away too much here, but the doctor who he knew in the convent, who kind of, recognized his brilliance and took him under his wing, who then turned out to be not exactly what we were all expecting. But I think it gave him a glimpse of, sensitivity towards others. And then there was one scene in particular that really struck me when Joseph was serving in the army and in Arab village, and there was a particular scene where an Israeli soldier was doing something that would have been, certainly against policy, and Joseph stepped in and stopped him. Again, I don't want to give any spoilers here, but throughout the whole narrative, you have this like an avenger against evil, that he was standing up for his values and standing up for his principles and really living according to what he knew in his heart was moral and did everything that he could to restore that morality to the world.
I mean, and he's not a superhero.
Right.
He's a person with all the natural limitations of a person, but he has a sense of justice, and he's trying to do justice. He doesn't have difficulty making up his mind. When he realizes that there's something that needs to be done, he does it. So he's not wishy-washy. I think he can be very decisive, but he also, like the author, wants to know everything about everything. I'm not saying he's me, and I'm not him, but that trait I think he shares with the author of the book, and so his decision making is based on knowledge,
Mm.
without which I think he would feel like he's not in a position to make choices. And he's influenced by he was an orphan with two living parents. And so throughout his life, you probably noticed he's constantly in search of father figure. And there are several men whom he encounters who could play the role of father figure to him, even though some, at least one of those people is 2 years older than he is. And also he's desperately in search of relationship with I mean, his relationships with women are what drive the whole story. So I think, for me at least, and this is something that I'm now speaking as a reader almost. I wrote the book, but I also am a kind of a consumer of the book. Those elements, I think, that was his lifelong search to seek wholeness in his relations with people, and it's the recovery from the trauma of having lived through being abandoned by his father and his.
Mhm. It's actually something that I wanted to talk about with you is the role of the women in the book, because it's clear that he has this, I guess, this, fantasy of, and what's driving him throughout his whole life is to have a connection with women. So I'm curious if you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, yes, he's very passionate about some women. He was totally in love with his mother in a, completely appropriate way, of course, but he idolized his mother, and then, yet she abandoned him.
Yeah.
And so the trauma, psychological trauma, I think was very great for him. And then there's another mother figure, such a great mother figure for him, who it's the abbess at the convent. She was so nurturing, and then he lost her, and she was replaced by someone, almost a diametric opposite of that first abbess. And he falls in love with a young woman, is the love of his life, who he also loses. And then there's another minor character, a woman who what. It's not so much about his relationship with that woman. She's a minor character, but what she represents to him that I think it gives him purpose. Is his lifelong quest is for himself, because he has a mission for the state of Israel that he's working on. He believes in the state of Israel. He's going to do whatever he can to ensure its safety. But for himself, he needs to resolve these issues of his relationships with these women in his life. Three essential relationships: with his mother, with the abbess, the second abbess who was cruel to him, and with the love of his life, a character named Isabella.
As we finish up, I have two more questions for you. One is, do you have any advice for other writers who are aspiring to publish their book?
Well, I mean, for Jewish authors and people publishing about Israeli matters or conflict in the Middle East, it's a very difficult environment. And, I don't really have advice that's based on any kind of success because, like many other authors, I was unable to break through the great wall that has been erected since October 7th towards works that are not anti-Zionist or anti-Israel or portray Palestinian suffering. There's a tremendous, I'll call it bias against Jewish authors and against authors who are, even in my book, it's not, my book is not a Zionist book, but it doesn't apologize for Zionism. It treats Zionism as a thing that ought to exist. So I think it's a very difficult time. I self-published this book. I could not get a publisher interested in this. And then for authors in general, I have experienced that, you have to start small and expand, develop your skills. I think one book that influenced me, there's so many books about the craft of writing. One that I felt was influential for me is Stephen King's On Writing. I think that's a really terrific, accessible book. He's obviously such a successful author.
And
I don't present myself as an authority on this topic. Come back to me when I'm successful and famous, and then I'll have more advice for people.
well, you've published plenty, so that already puts you in a different league than a lot of other people out there who kind of dream about it and don't ever, actually publish. So,
For me, it's not, I think some people write just to write. They're writing for themselves. That doesn't characterize me. I want people to read what I write. I'm writing for the audience. So success to me would require thousands of people to read my work and to think it's worthy of their time.
mhm.
So I have not yet achieved the level of success that I aspire to.
Hopefully this will spark their interest and that will change. What is the message that you are looking to bring to the world with The Wolf Shall Dwell with the Lamb? And what is one conversation that you're hoping that the book will spark?
I first want people to consider it worth their time, good literature that they found, messages in there that reflect something new and, give them a perspective they haven't had before. And I think what I said earlier, really, about restoring people's faith and commitment to the Zionist enterprise and to believing that Zionism is a just cause and that in the end it's possible to achieve peace in the Middle East, which involves having a Jewish state in the land of Israel, but also allowing Palestinian Arabs to have self-determination and autonomy and all the things that people ought to have in their lives. Freedom, fewer restrictions on their movement and on their activities. And I don't provide a solution to how do we get there. And I think it will take decades to get there. But I think perhaps people will see that if you focus on human beings, it might be possible.
Well, I really want to thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I hope it's the first of more to come. I just really appreciate that that you brought us into your world and that you're giving us some of the behind the scenes behind your book. And I encourage everyone to pick up a copy of The Wolf Shall Dwell with the Lamb. We'll put the link below.
Thank you, Deet. I've really enjoyed speaking with you, and you're doing good work. Thanks
Thank you.
for helping to disseminate word about this.
My pleasure.